So, you want to own a funeral home. Find the building, paint it cream, hang the sign, and let the community come to you. The demand is permanent. The customer is in shock. The decision window is short. The price comparison almost never happens. But here's the strange part. Owning a funeral home is one of the few businesses on the planet where you can earn more per square foot than a luxury hotel. And almost nobody outside the industry has any idea. By the end of this video, you'll know where the money actually comes from inside a funeral home, why the visible products are the smallest part of the math, and why the smartest operators in the business are quietly buying every family-owned funeral home they can find. If you want to follow the numbers all the way through, hit subscribe before you forget. It costs nothing, and it keeps videos like this one coming. Funeral homes come in 3 sizes, and they're 3 completely different businesses. A small rural funeral home in the American Midwest or the British countryside costs around $300,000 to $800,000 to buy. For that money, you get a converted Victorian house, a single preparation room, 1 hearse, a small chapel that seats 60, and a customer base of 50 to 120 families a year. Most of these places are owned by 2nd or 3rd generation funeral directors who inherited the building from a parent. Profit is steady, volume is small. The owner answers the phone at 3 in the morning because there is nobody else to answer it. A suburban funeral home is a different animal. Think the kind of building you've driven past 1,000 times without registering it. Quiet brick facade, manicured lawn, a discreet sign, a parking lot in the back. The price tag runs $1.5 million to $4 million. A real preparation facility, 2 or 3 chapels of different sizes, a fleet of 3 to 5 vehicles, a refrigeration unit, and an on-site crematorium if the local zoning allows it. Customer base of 200 to 500 families a year. And then there's the top of the pyramid, a multi-location funeral business in a major metropolitan area. Service Corporation International, the largest funeral company in the world, operates over 1,500 locations across North America and is valued at over $10 billion on the New York Stock Exchange. Dignity, the largest operator in the United Kingdom, was taken private in 2023 in a deal worth over £280 million. These are not family businesses anymore. They are consolidation platforms with chapels attached. But the purchase price is just the start. 2 more costs nobody warns you about. The first is the license, except in the funeral world, it's not 1 license, it's several. The funeral director needs a state license, which in most American states requires a mortuary science degree and a 1 to 2 year apprenticeship. The building needs a funeral establishment license. If you operate a crematorium, you need a separate cremation license. If you transport remains across state lines, you need federal compliance. If you sell pre-need funeral contracts, where customers pay in advance for their own funerals years before they die, you need a state insurance license on top of everything else. Most jurisdictions also require continuing education every 2 years. The second cost is the equipment and the inventory, which is more specialized and more expensive than people realize. A single hearse costs $80,000 to $120,000 new. A refrigeration unit for storing remains runs $40,000 to $80,000. An embalming room with proper ventilation, drainage, and sanitation systems can cost $100,000 to build out to code. A modern cremation retort, the industrial furnace used for cremation, costs $150,000 to $300,000 and burns through replacement parts every few years. Caskets sit in inventory at wholesale costs of $200 to $2,000 each, marked up 2 to 5 times at retail. Then there's the consolidation pressure. Service Corporation International, Carriage Services, and a handful of private equity-backed groups have been quietly buying family-owned funeral homes across North America for the last 30 years. They typically pay 4 to 7 times annual earnings for a profitable independent home. Keep the original family name on the building so customers don't notice, and centralize purchasing, embalming, and management across a regional cluster. The customer thinks they're calling the same family that has served the town for 100 years. The customer is calling a publicly traded company headquartered in Houston. Even the smallest funeral director in the smallest town understands the same thing the largest operator does. A funeral home is a piece of community infrastructure that prints recurring local demand, controls the timing of every transaction, and decides which suppliers get to sell into the local market. That's why the consolidators keep buying, the families keep selling, and the customers almost never notice the change. So you've got the building, you've got the license, you've got the hearse, the staff, the chapel, the inventory, the phone is ringing. Now we get to the question that actually matters. Where does the money come from? The obvious answer is the casket, the polished mahogany box at the front of the showroom, the brochure with the price list, the arrangement conference where the family chooses between bronze and oak. And all of that is true. But the obvious answer is also the wrong answer. The casket is not the business. The casket is the prop. The actual business is sitting on an itemized invoice that the family will sign without reading. In a building, they will leave within an hour, on a day they will not remember clearly for the rest of their lives. Every funeral home on earth earns money in 3 completely different categories, and the split is not what you'd guess. The industry calls them service fees, merchandise, and cash advances. Service fees are everything the funeral home does itself. The basic services of the funeral director and staff, embalming, dressing, casketing, the use of the facilities for visitation, the use of the chapel for the ceremony, the hearse, the limousines, transportation of remains. Merchandise is the physical products, caskets, urns, burial vaults, memorial cards, register books. Cash advances are the things the funeral home pays for on the family's behalf and bills back. The death certificate fees, the cemetery charges, the obituary placement, the clergy honorarium, the flowers. At a typical funeral home, service fees and merchandise each run around 40 to 45% of revenue. Cash advances run 10 to 20%. And the margin profile across those 3 is wildly different. Easiest way to picture it. Imagine a family arranges a traditional funeral with burial. The total invoice comes to around $12,000 in the United States, where the median traditional funeral now runs between $8,000 and $15,000 depending on region. Of that, around $5,000 is service fees, which is almost pure margin because the labor and overhead are largely fixed regardless of how many funerals you run that week. Around $4,000 is merchandise, where a casket that the funeral home bought wholesale for $600 sells for $2,400, and a burial vault that cost the home $400 sells for $1,500. Around $3,000 is cash advances, which mostly pass through with a small handling fee added. The funeral home keeps a share of every line, the family signs the invoice, nobody comparison shops. Now multiply that by 200 families a year at a suburban funeral home. The numbers stop being theoretical. A suburban funeral home serving 200 families a year, with an average revenue per service of $9,000, generates $1,800,000 in annual revenue. The owner's take-home after staff, building, vehicles, inventory, and licenses is typically $300,000 to $600,000 a year. A larger operation serving 400 families a year can clear over $1 million in annual owner income. The industry average operating margin sits between 20 and 30%, which puts funeral homes ahead of restaurants, retail stores, and most service businesses by a wide margin. Service Corporation International, the publicly traded consolidator, reported over $4 billion in revenue in 2023 with operating margins above 20%. That kind of margin profile, on revenue that is essentially recession-proof, is why the industry has been quietly bought up. Then there's the casket itself. The casket is not a piece of furniture. The casket is the anchor product that lets the funeral home set the price point for the entire service. A standard metal casket costs the funeral home around $600 to $800 wholesale and retails for $2,000 to $3,500. A solid wood casket costs the funeral home $1,200 to $2,000 wholesale and retails for $4,000 to $7,000. The most expensive caskets, the ones lined with velvet and finished in polished hardwood with bronze accents, retail for $10,000 to $25,000, and almost nobody buys them. But they exist for a specific reason. They anchor the price ladder. When a grieving family walks into the showroom and sees a $20,000 casket at one end and a basic metal casket at $3,000 at the other end, the $5,000 casket in the middle feels reasonable. The industry has known this for decades. The pricing is engineered, and here's the part that breaks people's brains. The longer you keep the family inside the building, the more the math works. The industry calls it the arrangement conference. The arrangement conference is the product. Every minute a family spends in the room with the funeral director, surrounded by sympathy cards and soft lighting and discreet brochures, is a minute where additional services get added to the invoice. Reception room rental for the gathering after the service. Programs printed with a photograph of the deceased. Audio-visual tributes set to music. Memorial videos. Personalized urns. Custom register books. Floral arrangements above and beyond what the family ordered. Each of these is a small upsell. Together, on a single arrangement, they add $1,000 to $3,000 to the invoice. So, now look at the architecture. Walk through any modern funeral home. Notice anything? The chapel is at the front, but the casket showroom is at the back, which means the family walks past the arrangement office, the reception room, the urn display, and the merchandise wall on their way to choose a casket. The lighting is dim, the carpet is thick, the seating is comfortable in a way that encourages people to stay. There are no clocks. The arrangement office has tissues on the desk and a printed catalog with prices listed in a small, restrained font. The industry has a term for it: dignified merchandising. Every square foot of the building exists to support a single transaction at the highest reasonable price point. The psychology is even sharper than the architecture. A bereaved family is a customer in a state no other industry encounters at scale. They are grieving, they are operating on no sleep. They are choosing between options they have never compared before and will likely never compare again. They are aware that the rest of the extended family is watching, which means they are buying not just for the deceased, but for the social judgment of every relative who will attend. Cheap looks, disrespectful. Expensive looks, loving. The funeral director does not push. The funeral director listens, presents options, and lets the family choose. The choice almost always goes upward, and at the very top of this pyramid sits the pre-need contract. Pre-need is the contract a customer signs years or even decades before they die, locking in the price of their own funeral at today's rates, paid in installments to the funeral home in advance. The customer thinks they're protecting their family from future inflation. The funeral home is collecting an interest-free loan, locking in a customer who cannot now choose a competitor, and securing revenue that will land on the books years from now with almost no acquisition cost. Service Corporation International holds over $15 billion in pre-need contracts on its books. That is not a service backlog. That is a financial product. So here's the whole revenue model in one sentence. Local mortality rate multiplied by average service ticket, multiplied by merchandise attachment, multiplied by pre-need book. And every single decision in the building, from the carpet color to the casket lineup to the funeral director's tone of voice, exists to maximize one of those four numbers. The casket is bait. The service is the trap. The grieving family is the product. And the dignity, the thing most people think the business is built on, is the cover story that keeps the margin invisible. So, with all this guaranteed demand, all this captive pricing power, all this engineered margin, why do funeral homeowners ever sell out to the consolidators? The short answer is the burnout. Out of every dollar of funeral home revenue, an enormous portion is gone before the owner sees anything. A typical funeral home runs on a 20 to 30% net margin, which is excellent by any standard. So, out of $1,800,000 in revenue at a suburban home, the owner keeps around $360,000 to $540,000. Where does the rest go? About a quarter disappears into staff costs. A funeral home needs at least one licensed funeral director, often 2 or 3, plus embalmers, drivers, attendants for visitations, and administrative staff. A licensed funeral director earns $60,000 to $90,000 a year in most American markets, more in major cities. Another large chunk goes to the building, mortgage or lease on a property zoned for funeral services, which is harder to find and more expensive than equivalent retail space. Utilities run high because chapels and reception rooms are heated and cooled even on days when no service is scheduled. Then, there's the stuff most people never think about. Vehicle fleet maintenance and insurance on hearses and limousines. Refrigeration equipment that runs 24 hours a day. inventory carrying costs on caskets, urns, and burial vaults that sit on the showroom floor for months, compliance costs around embalming chemicals, biohazard disposal, and federal funeral rule documentation, pre-need trust requirements that force the funeral home to hold customer deposits in regulated accounts, sometimes for decades before the service is ever performed. And then there is the cost most people never see. The owner of a small funeral home is on call 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Death does not schedule itself. A family calling at 2 in the morning expects an answer at 2 in the morning. A second-generation owner who inherited the building from a parent has spent 30 years missing family dinners, missing children's school events, missing holidays because somebody in the community needed them. The financial margin is real. The personal margin disappears entirely. The guaranteed top line is real. Everything below it is a fistfight. That fistfight is where most funeral homeowners eventually lose, and it has a small set of repeat patterns. Funeral homes can fail for a lot of reasons, but two mistakes show up over and over again. Mistake 1. Overpaying for a struggling acquisition. The independent funeral home market is full of second and third generation owners who want to sell because their adult children chose other careers. The asking price is usually 4 to 7 times annual earnings. A buyer who pays 7 times for a home, generating $300,000 a year in earnings, has committed over $2 million, often with significant debt. If the local death rate dips for 2 years, or if a competitor opens nearby, or if cremation rates in the area climb faster than expected, the debt service can swallow the margin entirely. Don't buy a funeral home on the assumption that the next decade will look like the last one. Cremation rates in the United States have climbed from around 25% in 2000 to over 60% in 2024, and cremation services average around $3,000 to $4,000 compared to $9,000 to $15,000 for traditional burial. The same family that paid $12,000 a generation ago now pays $4,000 for the same name on the building. Mistake 2. Wrong product for the market. This one has killed a lot of homes. A traditional funeral home in a community shifting toward direct cremation is selling caskets to a population that does not want caskets. A high-end facility in a neighborhood demographically aging downward is selling $6,000 packages to families who can afford $3,000. A funeral home in a city where the population is becoming more religiously diverse, more secular, or more transient is selling Christian funeral traditions to customers who want Hindu cremation rites, Muslim burial within 24 hours, Jewish services without embalming or no ceremony at all. Independent operators who failed to adapt their facilities, their staff training, and their service menus have lost market share to competitors who did. Some have closed, some have sold to consolidators at distressed valuations. Step back for a second. The economics of this industry are paradoxical. A funeral home has one of the most reliable revenue mechanisms in business. There is no other industry where the customer base is statistically guaranteed, the purchase decision cannot be postponed, and the price is set by the seller rather than negotiated by the buyer. And yet independent funeral homeowners are selling out to consolidators at the highest rate in the industry's history. Why? Because the math only works for a generation, and the generation is ending. Every independent funeral home takes decades to build a reputation, and that reputation lives in the owner's relationships with the local clergy, the local hospice nurses, the local nursing home directors, the local hospital chaplains. The reputation does not transfer cleanly to the next owner. The consolidator does not need it to. The consolidator has scale, purchasing power, and centralized embalming. The independent had relationships. The relationships die with retirement. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question. How much money do you make if you do this right? 2 scenarios, real numbers. Scenario 1, a small rural funeral home, $500,000 to buy. Annual revenue around $600,000 from 80 families a year, mostly traditional burial with rising cremation share. After all operational costs, your real take-home is around $120,000 to $180,000 a year. Payback 4 to 6 years. Not glamorous, recession-resistant. The most reliable small business with the word Funeral in it, Scenario 2. A suburban funeral home doing 200 services a year. $2,500,000 to buy. Annual revenue around $1,800,000. And here's a fun fact most people miss. Only around 40% of that comes from caskets and merchandise. The other 60% is service fees, pre-need contracts, cremation services, reception rentals, and aftercare products. A modern funeral home is barely a casket showroom. It's an event venue that uses the funeral as the loss leader to pull a family into the building. Net profit after everything, around $450,000 to $600,000 a year. Add another $100,000 if your pre-need book is well managed, payback 5 to 7 years. Then you're earning over $500,000 a year on a building most of your neighbors have never noticed. And if you survive long enough, you become something specific. The largest funeral home operators in the world have built fortunes most people never associate with the industry. The Waltrip family founded Service Corporation International in 1962 in Houston and built it into a publicly traded company now operating over 1,500 locations across North America. Valued at over $10 billion on the New York Stock Exchange. The Loewen Group, before its bankruptcy in 1999, was at one point the second largest funeral company in the world. The consolidators who built generational wealth in this industry did it by treating the funeral home as a real estate and royalty business, not a service business. So if you do decide to own a funeral home, just remember the most important rule of this business. The casket is the bait, the grief is the leverage, the building is the asset. Make sure you're not buying a service. You're buying a piece of local infrastructure that prints money in the quietest way any business ever has.